Okay, we'll see how far we get, but this is Understanding the Culture, Chapter 9, which is on sexuality. Number 1, or Section 1, the cost of sexual freedom. The last few years of Christopher's life had been a disaster. Convinced he was gay, he immersed himself in the lifestyle, porn and parties. Disoriented from drugs, expelled from dental school, and tracked by the police as a drug dealer, Christopher was near the end when his parents showed up at his apartment trying to help. Christopher shouted at them, "I don't want your religion. I don't want your Bible. I don't want you here. Just leave. Get out. And if you ever bring up God or the Bible, you will never see me again." Silently, Christopher's mom, Angela, asked God for the stamina to pray and work for Christopher's restoration. She fasted for 39 days. It took a prison term and an HIV/AIDS diagnosis for Christopher, but her prayers were answered. Christopher came to faith in Christ and today teaches at a Bible college. He and his mother travel the country sharing the story of how God worked in their lives to draw them to Christ. Still, Christopher admits sexuality is a daily battle. "I'd learned that I could live without sex," he says, "but what about my sexuality?" He wanted to change, but change is hard, and the culture says that homosexuals can't and shouldn't change. Christopher has concluded change is not the absence of struggles. Change is the freedom to choose holiness in the midst of our struggles. I realize that the ultimate issue has to be that I yearn after God in total surrender and complete obedience. Many today see their sexual orientation as the central aspect of their identity. Our bodies are all we have, and our sexual impulses are our strongest biochemical reactions. Therefore, sexual expression is the key to authenticity. Indeed, many think that securing sexual freedom for everyone is the pinnacle of liberty. Says commentator Rod Dreher, sexuality is how the modern American claims his freedom. Sexual freedom has come at a high cost, though. 1 out of 6 people between the ages of 14 and 49 now have herpes, for which there is no known cure, and more than 1.2 million have HIV/AIDS. About 20 million new sexually transmitted diseases, STDs, are diagnosed each year, and half are among those ages 15 to 24. This means that about 25% of teens will contract an STD. But this is about more than STDs. At its heart, the sexual revolution is a struggle for culture itself. Said famed psychologist Philip Reef, "The death of a culture begins when its normative institutions fail to communicate ideals in ways that remain inwardly compelling." As we'll see in the next chapter, heterosexual monogamous marriage has long been at the heart of Western civilization, but the modern age thought it had a better idea, one that would lead to blissful happiness. So why are we mired in confusion and despair? There is a way out. The journey to sexual wholeness isn't an easy one, and it requires us to live out unpopular ideas that court mockery and spite. Much of what you'll read in this chapter ignores the rules of political correctness, but I hope that doesn't stop you from considering it. Sorry. As the late Chuck Colson said, orthodoxy often requires us to be hard precisely where the world is soft, and soft where the world is hard, in every way that matters. Christianity is an affront to the world. It is countercultural. What is countercultural about a biblical view of sexuality, however, may surprise you. God loves sex. In fact, he invented it. If we pay close attention to what he says in the Bible, we can learn to love sex too. Real sex. Sex that builds trust rather than destroying it. Sex that finds its highest fulfillment in a faithful marital relationship with the prospect of producing children rather than just being an outlet for physical urges. Together we'll explore a call to a radical life, one of openness and honesty about our sexual feelings and failings, one of grace to those experiencing the consequences of sexual brokenness, and one in which we can experience intimacy with our Creator in a way that transcends sexual brokenness and restores us as deeply loved image bearers of God. Section 2, what is the problem? If sex was God's idea and He created it, why shouldn't we be free to express our sexuality any way we desire? Because God recognizes only one kind of legitimate sexual relationship. As Professor Denny Burke puts it, the only sex desire that glorifies God is that desire that is ordered to the covenant of marriage. When sexual desire or attraction fixes on any kind of non-marital erotic activity, it falls short of the glory of God and is by definition sinful. The Bible begins sketching out its sexual ethic. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. That's in Genesis. As we will see in this chapter and also in chapter 10, the Christian worldview holds that this view alone ensures individual happiness as well as a healthy society. But for several generations now, there has been a revolt against the biblical view of sexuality. Where did it come from and where is it headed? The history of the sexual revolution. A revolution is a rebellion against an established order. The seeds of the sexual revolution were planted during the Age of Enlightenment, when the church began to be viewed as a barrier to societal advancement. In the 1800s, Darwinism gave people room to believe that the universe wasn't the product of a loving creator, and that humans were just complex animals for whom any constraint on sexual impulses was unnatural. But it wasn't until the 1900s that the sexual revolution truly took hold. In 1905, Austrian psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud published a book called 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. Sorry, I'm having trouble with my throat tonight. Freud outlined what he saw as the stages of sexual development in humans and asserted that sex is basic to humanity's needs and desires. Following Freud, sexual freedom advocates such as Havelock Ellis and Bertrand Russell began openly encouraging premarital intercourse and homosexuality. Russell, a philosopher and mathematician who enjoyed sharing his opinion on a variety of topics, argued that not having sex before marriage was just as absurd as it would be if a man intending to buy a house were not allowed to view it until he had completed the purchase. Margaret Sanger, the mother of birth control and the first president of Planned Parenthood, shared this snide attitude. She advocated birth control and sterilization, both voluntary and involuntary. Sanger labeled minority groups as genetically inferior and called them human weeds, and said that the morality of those who refused to limit the number of children they bore was actually moral imbecility. Unsurprisingly, these individuals lived out what they taught. Russell had several marriages and adulterous relationships. Sanger had several adulterous affairs, including one with Havelock Ellis. Ellis encouraged his wife to have lesbian relationships, which he then researched. Today, though, it is widely believed that suppressing sexual desire hurts people. This materialist, Darwinist view flowered most notoriously in the research of Alfred Kinsey, who issued 2 reports, Sexual Behavior in the Human Male and Sexual Behavior in the Human Female, which challenged traditional views on sex and marriage. Kinsey's seemingly scientific reports, though now known to have been based on faulty and fraudulent research, had a tremendous impact. To those convinced of Freud's and Kinsey's arguments, religious rules about sexuality make people unhealthy, unhappy, and mean. The sexual revolution portrayed religious standards of sexuality as immoral and unhealthy because those promoting the sexual revolution were pre-committed to materialism, which says that only the material world exists and that the supernatural world is an illusion. Yet while many sought to eliminate God from the sexual revolution, others sought to enlist his support for it. In language presaging modern efforts to deny the Bible's teachings on homosexuality, Rustum and Della Roy wrote in Honest Sex that premarital chastity and adultery weren't that important to God. Infinitely better scholars than we have established that one cannot find any literal or simple connection in the Bible claiming that monogamy, chastity, and the prohibition against adultery and masturbation were God's law or will, they wrote. Joseph Fletcher went even further, saying that so-called moral absolutes such as prohibitions on lying, adultery, fornication, and theft were sometimes permissible, depending on the situation. He suggested that each of the 10 Commandments be amended to add the word ordinarily. These influences generated a tectonic shift in the West's moral core and weird drowning in the resulting tsunami. Comprehensive sex education, now the norm even for young children, teaches a radical sexual libertinism. Few people blink when sexually explicit books or those that normalize same-sex relationships, such as Heather has two mommies, are featured in school libraries. The absolute of complete individual autonomy has replaced the biblical absolute of sexuality inside of marriage. And as the celebrated French sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville, who visited America in the 1830s, wrote, "Such individualism is selfish, and it tears at the fabric of society." According to de Tocqueville, selfishness blights the germ of all virtue. Individualism at first only saps the virtues of public life, but in the long run it attacks and destroys all others and is at length absorbed in downright selfishness. As it turns out, true freedom is one thing the sexual revolution failed to provide. Its handcuffs may be wrapped in velvet, but they are handcuffs nonetheless. As one blogger articulately noted, we're told that we're sexually liberated if we throw ourselves at strangers and give ourselves over to people who couldn't possibly care less about us. If modern attitudes about sex have liberated us, what precisely have we been freed from? Security, commitment, trust? Let freedom ring, right? John Stonestreet agrees. Nothing is costing our society more. Nothing is costing our churches and our homes more. Nothing is creating more human casualties than sexual brokenness masquerading as sexual freedom. How is the sexual revolution hurting people? Let's look at both the personal and social consequences. Disordered sexuality. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis illustrated disordered sexuality, imagining a country in which a full theater of people would watch as a covered plate was brought to the stage and a piece of meat was unveiled in the manner of a striptease act. Lewis asked, "Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food?" In such a country, it isn't that people are starving, Lewis pointed out, but that their appetites cannot be satiated in the way they're attempting to fulfill them. Of course, to those selling sexuality, this is exactly the point. Somehow you have to fill them up, but make them feel as if they're starving. That's what the sex industry does, and it's dehumanizing, Stonestreet explains, because it turns a beautiful, authentic part of God's creation into an impulse so base that it may be satisfied with virtual sex on a computer. Same-sex attraction issues. The sexual revolution also legitimized same-sex sexual relationships. In recent times, same-sex marriage has gained significant momentum through the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision Obergefell versus Hodges. The court didn't just find that laws against same-sex marriage are unconstitutional. It found that the Constitution guarantees the right to personal autonomy and demanded removal of restrictions that prevent people from legally pursuing it. In this one decision, the court overthrew a millennia-old definition of marriage and established a precedent for overturning future laws seen as inhibiting sexual freedom. In many ways, popular culture portrayals of homosexuality made this decision inevitable. Fewer than 4% of people are committed to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender lifestyle. But the overwhelmingly positive and constant portrayal of LGBT relationships in the media has led Americans to think that 25% of the population is LGBT. Many self-proclaimed Christian writers have gotten on board, including psychologists David Myers and bloggers Rachel Held Evans and Matthew Vines. These writers argue that everyone has the right to sex and that the Bible is ambiguous about homosexual sex. Therefore, sexual relationships with those of the same sex aren't necessarily ungodly. To be fair, many Christians advocating same-sex sexual relations say homosexual sex must be monogamous to be godly, but this isn't a condition many same-sex activists are willing to accept. Liberal commentator Andrew Sullivan, a homosexual man, says, "There is something baleful about the attempt of some gay conservatives to educate homosexuals and lesbians into an uncritical acceptance of a stifling model of heterosexual normality." Marvin Ellison, a Presbyterian church pastor and retired professor of Christian ethics at Bangor Theological Seminary, and a homosexual man, promotes a liberating Christian ethic called erotic justice that goes beyond the prevailing patriarchal paradigm. Ellison includes as ethical practices sadomasochism and polyamory. I never say those right. Greek for many loves, which he justifies based on the model of the three persons of the Trinity. As we'll see later in this chapter, these authors don't have some source of new knowledge about sexual matters. They've just decided to depart from what the Bible says. Pornography means the writings of a harlot. For men, pornography is usually visual. For women, it's often written, such as the book 50 Shades of Grey. Pornography is seemingly ever present. 35% of all web searches are now reportedly pornographic, and of those who use the internet, which is more than a third of the world's population, 42.7% view porn. And it's not just adults. According to some sources, up to 90% of 8 to 16-year-olds have viewed pornography online. Pornography changes how we view ourselves and how we treat others. As we saw in Chapter 7, a Princeton University study showed that viewing pictures of scantily clad women activated the tool use part of men's brains, causing them to view women as tools to be used. At the very least, regular viewing of pornography seriously damages true intimacy by treating people as objects of lust rather than as human beings. Frighteningly, pornography doesn't just change what people think about. It changes the anatomy and physiology of the brain itself. Citing the research of psychologist William Struthers, author Janice Krauss describes pornography as an addiction like crack cocaine that causes the brain to become neurochemically dependent on pornography viewing to produce the surge of feelings that can satisfy the brain's craving. In fact, pornography shrinks the areas of the brain connecting the decision-making sector to the sector that links behaviors to outcomes. It also reduces brain activity in areas related to motivation. In plain English, a person who regularly looks at porn eventually loses the ability to consider the consequences of such behavior and ultimately the desire to do anything except look at porn. Unfortunately, as we'll see next, these consequences aren't just personal. They affect all of society. Now move to the social consequences. Confusion. The sexual revolution has led to society-wide confusion. In an interview with Lena Dunham, star of HBO's hit show Girls, television critic Tim Malloy asked about the artistic value of having so many characters naked for so much of each episode. The show's producer, Judd Apatow, erupted, calling the question sexist and offensive. Malloy asked why he saw it that way, but Apatow wouldn't answer. Somewhere in Apatow's view, Malloy crossed the line, but Apatow wasn't willing to say where the line was or why it was drawn where it was. And if Malloy didn't understand why his question was out of line, then as scholar William Vogelli puts it in his droll analysis of the situation, his inability or refusal to recognize the boundaries of decent discourse was one more reason to condemn him. The rules have changed. Philosopher and pastor Dale Kuhn observes that one society's biggest taboos is one may not criticize someone else's life choices or behavior. Questioning another's sexual choices simply isn't tolerated today. Those who violate this rule will be shunned. Unfortunately, universities are making it even more confusing. Professors who trumpet aberrant sexuality are no longer viewed as dirty old men and women. They're celebrated as cutting-edge scholars. A growing number of colleges and universities offer degrees in LGBT studies. The City College of San Francisco LGBT Studies major, for example, incorporates queer theory in its course offerings. Among the required courses are queer creative process and queer cinema in the 70s. Not to be outdone, the University of Maryland offers a course on the queer child. Adding to these offerings, universities like Harvard University, the University of Southern California, and the University of Tennessee host sex weeks to screen pornographic films and hand out safe sex kits. But sex weeks and courses on queer theory seem tame compared to the offerings at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, Canada, where courses like The Dark Side of Sexuality and Sexual Pleasure involve theoretical and empirical examination of everything from pornography to paraphilia and sex toys to sexual role playing. Open pornographic discussion of sexuality has the effect of taking something deeply personal and mysterious and making it political and mechanical. Postmodernist scholar Jean-Francois Lyotard saw open perversion as a delightful way to gnaw away at the great institutionalized narrative apparatuses defining what is normal. Lyotard even defended the North American Man-Boy Love Association, whose goal is to legalize men having consensual sex with underage boys. When leading scholars openly defend a criminal inclination such as pedophilia, sexual freedom has taken a dangerous turn. This is especially true with pornography. Regular users are more likely to believe that sexual assault victims are to blame or that rape isn't a serious crime. 46% of child molesters have said that pornography directly led to their molestations. It is believed that thousands of children are exploited annually through child pornography and prostitution in the United States, and perhaps more than 1 million worldwide. Ironically, if you ask people if they're against rape, molestation, and sex trafficking, they'll say yes. Yet an astounding number support these very things with every click of their mouses. Worse, just like the cruel and arbitrary government that those in the aftermath of the French Revolution, the sexual revolution's new rules are even more arbitrary and bizarre than the ones it overthrew. For example, in 2014, among the offenses considered to constitute sexual violence on a University of Michigan website was withholding sex and affection. From comments made in response to an online article about it, students were apparently brought up on charges of sexual violence for being reluctant to make sex a part of their relationships. This kind of thinking is to sexual health what an antibiotic-resistant superbug is to physical health. It's mutating and deadlier than ever. Defiance. Admittedly, sexual politics would mean very little if humans weren't interested in sex, but we are. Historically, sexual relations have been tempered by morality, which isn't as much about rules as it is about forming character and minds. Our sexual morality affects how we approach everything else, from the role of science and government to issues like adultery, gay marriage, and abortion. Take same-sex marriage, for example. Commenting on his own research, sociologist Mark Regnerus notes that of the men who view pornographic material every day, or almost every day, 54% strongly agreed that gay and lesbian marriage should be legal, compared with around 13% of those whose porn use patterns were either monthly or less than that. In this study, porn use emerged as a significant variable even when a person's political views, marital status, age, religion, and sexual orientation were taken into account. Apparently, other researchers have speculated pornography use activates a sexually liberal mindset that embraces non-judgment toward and even approval of non-traditional sexual behavior. To theologian Albert Mohler, this is evidence that our worldviews are not shaped only by arguments and cognitive engagements, but also by impressions and experiences. Even economics can't escape the sexual revolution. Marxists have employed the language of sexual revolution to insist that capitalism speaks primarily to heterosexual maleness, and that it ought to give way to socialism, which speaks to the total decentered subjects of numerous genders that may exhibit many different subjectivities simultaneously, none of which are given privileges as representing the subject's real essence, whether natural or historical. The process of interpolation are also without a goal or end to which they are moving. No one is sure where this kind of thinking will lead, but it's an odd fact of the sexual revolution that it has moved from parading down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. in annual events like the Capitol Pride Festival to marching on Wall Street. When it comes to Main Street, the sexual revolution's target is the Christian faith. A study of Christian young men found that those who reported using pornography also reported lower levels of religious practice, lower self-worth, lower identity development regarding dating, and higher levels of depression. Of course, people can return to their faith even after making a series of bad choices, but some choices, such as sex outside of marriage and living together outside of marriage, seem to have a long-term diminishing effect on faith. How we relate to God affects our lifestyles, and our lifestyles in turn affect how we relate to God. Despair. The shifting sexual landscape makes it harder for people to find the meaning and purpose the marriage culture once provided. Scholars Arthur Levine and Jeanette Curtin wrote about college students. They're desperate to have only one marriage, and they want it to be happy. They don't know whether this is possible anymore. Is it any wonder that such unfulfilled longings for marital bliss lead to despair? Mark Regnerus theorizes that sexual promiscuity and pornography have changed the relational calculus for young adults. When sexuality was protected in marriage, women were also protected. If men wanted sex, they had to commit to marriage. As John Stonestreet puts it, women were able to keep the supply low through marriage, and men have a high demand. The sexual revolution, though flooded the market, the price of sex went down, especially when men, through pornography, were getting their demands met without even having another human being in the room. Suddenly, the price tag just bottoms out. Sex becomes cheap in the worst way possible. When a man insists that a woman live with him before getting married, a woman who wants a stable relationship feels she must agree. As of 2012, 7.8 million couples were living together in the United States, a 900% increase in the past 50 years. That's 2/3 of couples, and only 1 in 4 Americans disapproves of the trend. Cohabitation doesn't lead to better marriages, though. Numerous studies have indicated that it often doesn't lead to marriage at all. Cohabiting couples are more likely to separate, less likely to reconcile, and more likely to be unfaithful than married couples. Cohabiting before marriage has been associated with an increased divorce risk. Apologists for the living together trend say the age at which a couple is married, not whether they live together, determines the likelihood of divorce. A host of studies disagree, but even if it were true, it explains too little. Cohabiting couples report poorer relationship quality, accumulate less wealth, and are more likely to report depression and alcohol abuse. How the church contributes. The Bible considers sexual immorality to be sin, and yet it doesn't demean sexuality itself. Unfortunately, some of the church fathers, such as Chrysostom, Jerome, Origen, and Augustine, did. According to Pastor Randy Alcorn, the church's approach to sexuality since that time has made things even worse. In her zeal to hold the line against immorality, the church miserably failed to embrace or project a positive view of sex, he says. The church's anti-sexual posture was ultimately anti-human, since people are sexual beings. That posture not only set the stage for the sexual revolution, but caused the church to be caught flat-footed when the revolution came. Another reason the church's voice is muted on the topic of sexuality is that Christians themselves fall into sexual sin. Pornography is one clear example. My friend Josh McDowell believes that the issue of pornography is the greatest threat to the church in our time. Pastors and parishioners alike are addicted. Another example is hypocrisy. It has been said that hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. In other words, virtue is fake and hypocrisy is inevitable, or hypocrisy. It's deeply discouraging to those trapped in sexual brokenness to realize that the ones publicly holding up the standard of purity are privately committing mutiny against it. Indeed, as Dale Kuhn puts it, there is good reason to believe the sexual revolution has more profoundly impacted the behavior of 21st century Christians than the Bible. Christians ought to be concerned, and not just for themselves. If we want to have a positive influence on the culture, we need to care. And we'll stop right there.